In this video, we'll look at setting up the new Trails display mode in both xpFlowField and xpExplosiaFX. We'll then go on to set up how we would render this in Cycles 4D, but also in the standard and physical renderer. So let's have a look. We'll go to the Dynamics tab of this XP system, and let's go and bring in a FlowField object. Now, in its default settings, the FlowField object, the flow is set to default, which is on the +Z, and the field is set to directional force. So what's going to happen is, as the particles from this emitter enter the field, they're moved in the +Z direction, and the direction of our flow is visualized on default by these lines. If we go to the Display tab, we could change those type from lines to arrows, for example, and it shows the direction of that flow. But we can now select the new Trails mode. So let's just click Trails. I'm just going to deselect my emitter for a minute. So now we have a trail. Now this looks quite similar to line, but you can see that our trails have this gradient from blue to yellow mapped to them, and it is mapping the color gradient, which you can adjust here. So let's just go back to our Object tab. Let's reduce the cell size of our flow field to make it more detailed. And we're going to change the flow from default to, let's say, turbulence. So now this is an animated turbulence field, and you can see that our trails are beginning to animate, which in its own right looks pretty neat. Let's go to the Display tab. We can increase the length of our trails, and we can watch them grow in the viewport. This, of course, is animatable. Let's go to our Object tab. We'll reduce the scale of those. Let's decrease the frequency so they're not animating through quite so quickly. And we're getting this really intricate, interesting display mode. We can go to the Display tab. At the moment, by default, this is set to XY plane, which just gives us one plane's worth of trails. We can offset this plane throughout our flow field bounds. And this, of course, is animatable whilst we're playing through that turbulence field. And should you want to, you can visualize the entire grid. We can do that by changing the mode from XY plane to voxels. And now we're seeing the entire grid represented with these beautifully animating curved trails. Now, this is still working and affecting particles in exactly the same way. Let's just knock that back down to XY plane, reactivate our emitter. And if we hit play, you'll see that we're still getting the same effect on our particles. There is the turbulence affecting their motion, but we're beautifully visualizing that using these trails. And that is the key here. The new trails display means that the xpFlowField, as well as generating these custom force fields, is now a renderable object in its own right. Now we can also use Trail Display Mode directly in xpExplosiaFX. So let's just deactivate this flow field. In the Dynamics tab, we will bring in an xpExplosiaFX object. So let's just make the voxel size a bit bigger. We don't need much detail here. And we'll bring in Cinema 4D Platonic, just scale it down. And this is going to be the source of our smoke sim. So in the Platonic, let's go to Tags, xParticles tags, and let's put on an xpExplosiaFX source. So now if we hit play, we're going to get a smoke and fire sim. Let's just deactivate that green emitter. So we've got a sim here. Now in the default display, it's not particularly detailed. So let's go to xpExplosiaFX, display, and by default our mode is on grid, so we can increase the resolution of this grid display. Let's put the level of detail on to say 200%, and now we have got this grid detail of our smoke, and of course look, we can move that around, and there is our smoke sim. So we now have a new display mode. If we go to xpExplosiaFX display, we can change the mode from grid to trails. And we can increase the length of those trails. And now you can see that we're getting really nice trail display of our explosion, which is looking really nice. Now we can go on to use this explosion and link it with our flow field. So let's just deselect the visibility of xPlosierFX in the viewport and the render. So now obviously we can't see it, but it is still simulating. Let's go back to our flow field, reactivate it, and we're going to change it. Let's go to the Object tab. We will change the flow from turbulence, which is what we had, and we're going to change it to the new xPlosierFX option. So now we can drag in our xPlosierFX as the source flow mode, and you can see, look, our flow field is generating these trail display from our xPlosierFX object. If we take that platonic, we could move this around. Let's go to our flow field display tab. We could increase that length to say 200, much bigger lines, look, and that gives us a really nice representation of the upward movement of that smoke as it moves through our domain. If you prefer not to see the adaptive bounds of our xPlosierFX sim, we can go to xPlosierFX, Solver, and deselect the adaptive bounds, and then we get this really nice fixed look with all of those voxels being rendered. Really nice for FUI design. And in this mode, it's nice to go to our flow field, display, and really increase the length of that trail display. And we get these fantastically intricate trails. Now this is just in the XY plane mode, but we can visualize this entire xPlosierFX force field by going to voxels, and now we're seeing the entire effect as a whole voxel grid. Obviously, it's having to generate an awful lot more splines, so the viewport performance isn't as good, but we can visualize it. Let's put that back to the XY plane. And there we go, xPlosierFX directly within flow field, and then visualize using the new trails display. Let's have a look at how we would go about rendering our flow field trails display mode in both standard and physical renderer in Cinema 4D and using Cycles 4D. So we'll go to the Dynamics tag, let's bring in a new flow field object, and we'll set this up. Let's go to the Display tab, we will keep it on the XY plane, we will change the type to trail, let's make that length. We'll start with 200, and we'll go to the Object tab. We'll change the flow from default to turbulence, which gives us a nice look straight out of the bat, and we will reduce that scale a little bit. Let's reduce the cell size, making it more detailed. And there we go. Straight away got a pretty interesting trail display. So let's go about how we would render this. We need to use the xpDisplayRender generator to be able to create actual trails from these trail displays, and then we can get them rendered. So first of all, we'll start with how we would do this using Cycles 4D. So I'm just going to go to my layout and change it from standard to a Cycles 4D layout. So this is exactly the same scene. Here is my small viewport down here. This is where we'll get our interactive render. This is the Cycles 4D real-time preview window, and here is our node editor where we will build our materials. So first of all, what we need to do is get this set up in an xpDisplayRender generator. So to do that, we'll go to Generators, and in the pull-down menu, we will pick a xpDisplayRender. And in the xpDisplayRender, we need to generate not particle display. Let's pull this down. We want flow field display. So we'll click that, drag in our flow field. And now what we'll do is let's just make our flow field invisible in both the viewport and the renderer so that we can no longer see it. And we've got our display render. Now by default, geometry on render only is checked, and this is because it is much faster in the viewport. If it doesn't have to generate these actual trails in the viewport, it'll only do it at render time. But for us to work in Cycles 4D, we need to deactivate this checkbox. And as you can see, if we go to our viewport view, we've got our trails back. but these aren't the flow field display trails. These are generated trails which this display render has created, and we can render these. So let's go to our Cycles 4D material menu. We'll go to Surface and bring in an emission material. Let's drag this onto our display render object. And now look, we are rendering with a just off-white emission texture on our trails, and this will update in real time and animate through. All right, so that's pretty good. So now we want to be able to adjust these trails. We may perhaps want to make them thicker or thinner. So the way in which we would do that is like any Cycles 4D trail. We go highlight the object, go to the tags menu, Cycles 4D tags, and let's bring in a curve tag, which gives us those options. So now look, by default, the start of the curve is set to 1 centimeter, and it's going to taper off into a point at 0 centimeters. And we can see this happening on this trail down here, tapering off to a point. So let's just exaggerate this a little bit. If we put these up to say 3 centimeters start, we get a ribbon, and then they trail off into a point. This isn't what we want. Let's make these really small. Let's just say 0.1 and 0.1, so no taper. So now we've got our really fine trails rendering with an emissive material in the viewport. Let's refine this a little more. So I'm just going to make a little bit more room in the node editor. So just to demonstrate at this point, I'm going to change the color of our emission node to a, I mean, it could be anything. Let's just put it at a blue color like this. All right, so we're going to make an additive material in Cycles 4D. And what that will mean is where trails are overlapping, we will get kind of hot spots, and it'll look much more three-dimensional and much more interesting. And to do that is pretty simple. All we need to do is we need to get an emission shader. We also need a transparent shader. And what we want to do is add the output of these two together. So to add two shaders together, we need to go to shaders and bring in an add shader. And if we put our emission into the top port and our transparent into the bottom, and then output this to our surface of our trails, now we have got an additive material. Look, where we have got overlapping trails, we've got these really nice hot spots. So that looks much better. And we've got this really nice three-dimensional rendering trail display. Now, if we want to go back and be able to apply gradients to individual trails, we can do that really easily in Cycles 4D. So all we need to do is this. Let's just make a little bit of room. I'm going to move these down here, just dolly out a little bit. So I'm going to right-click, let's go and bring in an input node, and we want a hair info node, which is fantastic for trails. Let's bring that in. We've got a few different options here, and the one that we want, random, is a useful option. What random does, it gives a random grayscale value to each individual trail or each individual hair. So what we could do, if we wanted every single one of these trails to have its own individual color, we could use that random node like this. Look, let's bring in a converter color ramp. And in the color ramp, let's go to the node settings and let's load a preset with one of these linear interpolated color ramps. So maybe this one here. So if we put our random output into the factor and put the output from our color ramp into our, let's just come across so you can see, the output of our color ramp into the emission color, now every single trail has a randomly picked color from this assigned gradient. So that's pretty useful. But an even better one is our intercept output. And what this does, it applies a color gradient from black to white across the length of each individual trail, which is fantastic. So instead of piping our random into our color ramp, let's pipe our intercept in there. And now you can see that happening. It is coloring our trails from start to end along the color of this gradient. Now we've got this set up with this, it's actually set to step interpolation mode, which is not what we want. So if we just right click on that and we put interpolation of all knots to say cubic, now we have smooth interpolation, and that color gradient will be applied smoothly across the length of each trail. So let's pick a color preset with fewer colors on. Let's go to the presets and we'll pick, let's perhaps pick heat 2. So there we go, that's looking really nice. So now we have got fantastically colored trails in an additive material, and that is rendering in our real-time preview very fast with a fantastic result. So that is how you set up our FlowField trails display using xpDisplayRender and creating those materials and adjusting them in Cycles 4D. To render your FlowField trail display in the standard or physical renderer, it's very simple. Let's just go to our render settings, and we have ours set to the standard renderer. So all we need to do is create an xParticles material. So to do that, let's go down to Create in the Material Manager, Extensions, xParticles Material. Let's drag that onto our display render generator, and we can hit render, and there we have our trails, but they don't have any color at this point. Now we are able to adjust color in the xParticles materials. Let's just open up these settings. Let's reduce the scale down so they're not quite as fat. Let's put, say, 20% scale. And in the color tab of our material, let's change the mode from particle color to single color, and let's just pick, I don't know, let's pick a blue color. Okay, so now if we hit render, you can see that we have got these trails rendering. Now in xParticles, we can also create an additive render where we get nice hotspots where trails overlap. Let's go to the render settings, xParticles render settings, and change the blend from normal to add. Then hit render, and now we're getting that nice additive render. So there's one extra thing that we're able to do here. We are able to, if I just deactivate our display render and reactivate the visibility of our flow field, you see we've got these nice gradient colors, and these are given to our trails display. If we go to the flow field object display tab, we could adjust this gradient and pick whichever one we want. Look, let's load a preset, bring in the heat 1, and we can change those. That's looking pretty nice. So if we keep it at heat 1, let's say that we want those colors to be respected by the renderer. Now, to do that, let's just make flow field invisible. In our display render, we have single spline selected for the flow field trails, which means these are generated very quickly, but they don't retain the color information. What we can do is change this to segmented spline. Now, segmented spline takes a lot longer for xpDisplayRender to generate that geometry because it's having to generate all of these different splines and all of their individual segments. So it's much more computer intensive. But we need to do this to be able to pass on the colors. So what we're able to do at this point is select geometry on render only. If we click that, we no longer see the display render in the viewport, but we're able to then visualize it using our flow field, which means we have really fast feedback. Look, we can play through this and it plays really quickly, and it'll only generate the display render trails when we hit render. So now if we go back to our xParticles material and change the color from single color to particle color and hit render, you'll see that it'll take a couple of seconds to generate those trails via the xpDisplayRender. And once it has generated those, it will then render them to this view, and our colors will be respected, and we have our nice additive material. So that is how you set up the display render generator to render xpFlowField trail display using the standard or the physical renderer in Cinema 4D.